Imagine trying to read a single massive book
Okay.
from cover to cover. You sit down, you open chapter 1, and the genre is this epic, sweeping family drama. And you think, okay, I know how to read this.
Yeah.
But then you flip forward 50 pages, and suddenly you are reading a brutal, incredibly dry list of ancient zoning laws, or like highly specific regulations on how to handle mildew in your house.
Yeah, mildew laws. It's a real shift.
Right. And then you turn another 50 pages, and the text just shifts again. This time it's this exalted cosmic poetry about the stars singing and mountains melting. You haven't lost your mind, and you didn't accidentally pick up 3 different books. You've just opened the Old Testament.
It is a violently disorienting reading experience if you don't know what you are looking at. I mean, we modern readers, we crave categorization. We want our history books to be timelines, our legal manuals to be statutes, and our poetry to be neatly bound in a completely separate volume.
Exactly.
But the Old Testament just refuses to play by those rules. It is the absolute definition of literary muddy waters.
And that disorientation is exactly why we are doing this deep dive today. If you are listening to this and you have ever felt completely overwhelmed or intimidated or just utterly confused by this massive library of ancient texts, you are in the exact right place.
You are definitely not alone in feeling that way.
So our mission today is to give you a comprehensive, engaging shortcut to being genuinely well-informed about the Old Testament. We are decoding a remarkably rich source document by Chris R. Velazquez titled Survey of the Old Testament as a Whole, and we're going to use it to unpack the historical roots, the cultural psychology, and the enduring, gritty relevance of this ancient library. So, okay, let's unpack this. Before we even talk about the stories of Moses or David, we need to establish the basic ground rules of what this document actually is. Because frankly, even the name on the cover is a bit of a historical illusion.
That's right. If you hold up a book that says Old Testament on the spine, you are holding a title that just didn't exist when a single word of that text was actually written.
Wow.
Yeah. The term Old Testament is a retroactive, later Christian designation. The historical data points to a figure named Melito of Sardis, right around the year 170 CE, as one of the first to start using that specific phrasing. He used it to distinguish these much older texts from the emerging Christian writings.
So for people who actually wrote it, and for Judaism today, what is it called?
Well, in Judaism, this exact same collection of foundational texts is referred to as the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh. And it's not just a different name, it's a completely different structural architecture.
Right, and this is where I think people get really tripped up. If you go to a hotel room right now, open the nightstand, and pull out a standard Protestant Christian Bible, you are going to count 39 individual books in the Old Testament. But if you look at the Hebrew canon, the Tanakh, there are exactly 24 books. Now, the natural assumption is that someone, somewhere along the line, just added 15 extra books to the Christian version.
Which is a completely logical assumption. I mean, the math makes sense. But it's historically incorrect. The actual content, the words, the stories, the laws is identical.
I always like to think of it as a repackaged DVD box set. Let's say you own this massive, epic television series. In the Hebrew canon, it's released as 24 incredibly thick, long episodes.
Right. Massive scrolls.
Exactly. But when the Christian publishers came along, they looked at these massive scrolls and said, this is too hard to navigate. So they took the longest episodes and just split them down the middle. A massive book like Samuel gets chopped into 1st and 2nd Samuel. Kings becomes 1st and 2nd Kings. Chronicles get split.
Ezra and Nehemiah, too.
Yes, Ezra and Nehemiah, which were originally one continuous record, get separated. And then you have this one massive scroll in the Hebrew canon called the Book of the 12. It contains the writings of 12 different minor prophets. The Christian publishers just broke that out into 12 individual, very short books. So you aren't getting new material, you're just looking at a different filing system.
It's a brilliant way to conceptualize it. You're looking at the exact same library, just organized onto different shelves. But to really grasp what this library is communicating, we have to look behind the shelves. We need to go back to the drafting table of antiquity, like who actually wrote these words? Because there's a massive chasm between how a person in the 16th century would answer that question and how a modern historian answers it today.
Let's start with the traditional view. If I went back in time and asked an average reader a few hundred years ago, hey, who authored this massive collection? They would have given me a very neat, heroic list of names, right?
Very neat. In traditional Jewish and Christian reading, the authorship was assigned to towering, monumental individuals. Moses, acting almost as a divine stenographer, wrote the Torah, that's the first 5 books, from Genesis through Deuteronomy. The prophets were written by the literal men whose names are on the scrolls, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel.
And what about the poetry and the other writings?
Those writings, like Psalms and Proverbs, were assembled by great kings. David wrote the Psalms, Solomon wrote Proverbs. It's a view that assigns massive blocks of text to specific, solitary geniuses just sitting in a tent or a palace somewhere.
But I'm guessing modern scholarship doesn't quite buy the image of Moses sitting down with a massive stack of parchment and writing the entire history of the world in one long weekend.
Not at all. Modern historical analysis looks at the text and sees something vastly more complicated and honestly vastly more interesting. The scholarly view sees the Old Testament not as a series of standalone books written by solitary authors, but as a composite, multi-generational library. It is this incredibly complex tapestry that was woven, unraveled, rewoven, and meticulously edited over many, many centuries.
And the most famous example of this is how scholars look at the first 5 books, the Torah. The source material brings up something called the classic documentary model, which is often just referred to as J, E, D, and P. Now, I know that sounds like incredibly dense academic jargon, so walk us through what those letters actually mean and how scholars arrived at this idea. They didn't just guess, right?
Far from it. Scholars act as literary detectives. For centuries, close readers of the Hebrew text noticed some really strange things. They noticed that certain stories seem to repeat themselves with slightly different details. They noticed sudden, jarring shifts in vocabulary. And most obviously, they noticed that different parts of the text used entirely different names for God. Sometimes God is referred to exclusively as Yahweh, and then in other blocks of text, God is referred to as Elohim.
Wait, so instead of one guy writing it straight through, it's more like an editor taking 4 different historical accounts and stitching them together into one master narrative.
Precisely. That is the essence of the documentary model. So J stands for the Yahwist source, because it heavily utilizes the name Yahweh. E is the Elohist source. Scholars date these earliest oral and written traditions way back to the 10th century BCE.
Okay, so J and E are the oldest. What about D and P?
Then you have the D source, the Deuteronomist. This one focuses heavily on the law and the covenant, likely coming together around the 7th century BCE. And finally, the P, or priestly source. This source is completely obsessed with genealogies, dates, temple rituals, and order. Scholars believe the priestly editors did their work much later, likely during or after the Babylonian exile. That was a time when the Israelites were desperately trying to preserve their identity in a foreign land.
So you have a document that is actively being shaped, refined, and compiled over hundreds of years. You have oral traditions from the Bronze Age, you have court records from the Iron Age, and you have priestly editing happening during the Persian period. That is a staggering chronological scale.
It really is, and it happened across vastly different geographical settings, too. Some parts were composed in the royal courts of Jerusalem, some in the northern kingdom of Israel before it was destroyed, some by exiles weeping by the rivers of Babylon, and some by the beleaguered community that returned to rebuild a ruined province they called Yehud.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. We talked about the different filing systems of the Jewish Tanakh and the Christian Old Testament, but reorganizing the books isn't just some administrative quirk. It actually fundamentally changes the narrative flow of the entire library.
It totally changes the psychological impact of the ending. Look at the Jewish ordering, the Tanakh. It is arranged in 3 distinct blocks: the Torah, the prophets, or Nevi'im, and the writings, or Ketuvim. That ordering is deeply theological. Well, it starts with the absolute foundation, the divine instruction of the Torah. Then it moves into the prophets, which in the Hebrew mind actually includes the historical books like Joshua and Kings. It uses history as a lens to interpret whether the people obeyed the Torah or not. And finally, it ends with the writings, Psalms, Proverbs, Esther, Chronicles. The writings are all about how to live out this faith, how to worship, and how to hold on to hope. It's a journey from divine law to historical reality to worshipful reflection.
But the Christian canon reshuffles that exact same material. It orders it topically law, then history, then poetry, and finally prophecy. Why pull the prophets out and stick them at the very end of the book?
Because the Christian compilers had a very specific narrative goal. They restructured the library to deliberately tee up the New Testament. By placing the massive forward-looking prophetic books like Isaiah and Malachi at the very end, the final word of the Old Testament becomes an unresolved chord. It ends on a note of intense anticipation for a coming Messiah, a coming day of the Lord. And then you turn the page, and you are immediately reading the Gospel of Matthew, which opens with the genealogy of Jesus Christ.
It's essentially editing the end of the movie to make sure the audience is perfectly primed for the sequel.
Exactly.
The source text points out something profound about this relationship. It says the Old Testament provides the actual grammar for the New Testament. I love that phrasing. If you try to read the New Testament without the Old, you're basically trying to speak a foreign language without knowing any of the vocabulary.
You're reading the punchline without hearing the setup.
Hmm.
The Christian perspective insists that the Old Testament is not merely historical background or some irrelevant prequel. Christianity views it as the inspired record of creation, the trauma of human sin, the establishment of the covenant, and the long, painful preservation of a divine promise. Christianity makes the audacious claim that the Old Testament is a book full of deliberate, unfinished patterns.
Unfinished patterns. Give me an example of what that looks like.
Think about the massive institutions of the Old Testament. The sacrificial system slaughtering animals to cover sin, it never actually seems to permanently solve the problem of human guilt. They just have to keep doing it.
Right, it's a constant cycle.
Exactly. And the priesthood is constantly failing. The temple gets built, but then it gets destroyed by Babylon. The great kings of the Davidic line end up being corrupt and are dragged off into exile. Every single major institution in the Old Testament ends in a state of incompletion or failure. They are arrows pointing forward. And the New Testament explicitly claims that all of these unfinished patterns find their ultimate telos, their fulfillment, their climax, their absolute end goal in the person and work of Jesus.
You see that logic everywhere in the New Testament. The writers are constantly pulling quotes from the ancient prophets and saying, this event happened to fulfill what was written. The Old Testament is the foundational bedrock. But okay, we know how this massive library was assembled over centuries, and we know the theological architecture of how it's organized. But where did all this happen? We've been talking about texts and editors, but these were real people living on real dirt. Let's look at the map. Let's do some digging.
To understand the literature, you absolutely must understand the geopolitical reality of the ancient Near East. The land of Israel was essentially a tiny land bridge caught between massive, terrifying superpowers. To the south, you had the Empire of Egypt. To the north and east, in Mesopotamia, you had the Assyrians and later the Babylonians. Anyone who wanted to march an army from Africa to Asia had to walk right through Israel's backyard.
It's the worst real estate in the ancient world if you want to be left alone.
Oh, without a doubt.
Our source provides a highly compressed historical map to help us track the major eras. Let's walk through this timeline because this is the turbulent stage on which all these biblical dramas play out. We start with the patriarchal traditions.
This is the era of Genesis, the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The setting here is not a settled nation, but nomadic tribal life moving between city-states in Canaan and Mesopotamia. The dates are heavily debated by historians, but a conservative reading often places this era somewhere in the second millennium BCE. This is the era of the foundational promises, God telling a single family that they will become a great nation.
From there, the family grows, they migrate, and we enter the Exodus and wilderness period. Again, dates are highly debated, but the geography shifts drastically to Egypt and the brutal environment of the Sinai Desert.
This is the crucible of their national identity. It's the story of redemption from physical slavery, the formation of the covenant at Mount Sinai, the giving of the law, and the construction of the tabernacle. They enter Egypt as an extended family of slaves, and they emerge from the desert as a distinct, organized people bound to a deity.
Next is the settlement and the period of the Judges. This is broadly dated from around 1200 to 1020 BCE. They are back in the land of Canaan, but it is not the Golden Kingdom we picture. It is messy.
Incredibly messy. They are a decentralized, loose confederation of tribes. There is no king, no standing army, and no central capital. The Book of Judges describes this era as a violent, repeating cycle. The tribes fall into idolatry. God allows a foreign power to oppress them. The people cry out. God raises up a charismatic military leader called a judge to deliver them. There's a brief period of peace, and then the cycle just repeats.
It's a state of constant instability, which naturally leads the people to look around at the other nations and say, we need a king to protect us. That brings us to the United Monarchy. According to the historical data, this is a very brief window lasting only from about 1020 to 922 BCE.
It is a blip on the historical radar, really, but it casts a shadow over the rest of history. This is the Golden Age, the era of Saul, David, and Solomon. The tribes are finally centralized under one monarch. Jerusalem, or Zion, is captured and elevated as the political and spiritual capital, and Solomon builds the first great, magnificent temple. It is the absolute peak of their geopolitical power.
But the peak is incredibly fragile. Solomon dies, his son makes some terrible political miscalculations, and in 922 BCE, the kingdom fractures right down the middle. This initiates the divided kingdom era. You have 10 tribes in the north forming the kingdom of Israel, and 2 tribes in the south forming the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital.
And this divided reality is a total disaster. Both of these tiny, weakened kingdoms are now facing the relentless pressure of those massive regional superpowers we talked about, first Assyria, then Babylon. This is the era when the great prophets appear, men like Isaiah, Amos, and Hosea.
What were they doing? Just predicting the future?
No, not at all. They act more like divine prosecuting attorneys. They stand in the royal courts and in the streets, bringing a covenant lawsuit against the kings and the people for their idolatry and their systemic injustice. They warn that if they don't change, the empires will devour them.
And the tragic reality is the prophets were right. The warnings come true. The northern kingdom of Israel is utterly obliterated by the brutal Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. The southern kingdom of Judah manages to hold out for another century and a half, but eventually they fall to the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and the date 586 BCE is burned into the memory of this people.
586 BCE is the trauma that defines the Old Testament. Jerusalem is besieged and starved. The city walls are breached. Solomon's magnificent temple is burned to the ground, and the elites, the royal family, the priests, and the artisans are shackled and deported hundreds of miles away to Babylon. This is the exile.
It must have been devastating.
It creates a massive theological crisis. The Israelites had to ask, did our God lose? How can we be God's chosen people if we have lost our promised land, our anointed king, and the very temple where God's presence was supposed to dwell?
Yeah, it must have felt like the absolute end of their religion. But the remarkable thing is it wasn't. Next on the timeline is the Persian Restoration. In 539 BCE, the Persian Empire conquers Babylon. And the Persian king, Cyrus, has a totally different foreign policy. He actually allows the exiles to pack up and return to their ruined homeland, which is now just a tiny province called Yehud.
Right. And from 538 to roughly 332 BCE, we see a fragile, incredibly difficult restoration. The returned exiles, under leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, painstakingly rebuild a much smaller, less impressive temple. They rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And most importantly, they dive deep into the Torah to reestablish their identity so they never face the wrath of exile again. Finally, from 332 BCE onward, Alexander the Great sweeps through. That initiates the Hellenistic period, bringing immense Greek cultural pressure, which is the environment in which some of the very latest biblical writings are finalized.
Okay, I have to stop you here. I need to push back on this.
Yeah.
This timeline you just laid out is incredibly detailed, almost cinematic. But if I'm a skeptic listening to this, I have to ask, how much of this is actually hard, verifiable history? Are we talking about undisputed facts, or is this primarily theological storytelling meant to make a point? The source mentioned something about maintaining a correct academic posture. What does that practically mean when we are staring at texts written thousands of years ago?
It's the most important question to ask. The perspective highlighted in our source, drawing from the academic consortium Bible Odyssey, demands a highly nuanced posture. It tells us we have to rigorously avoid 2 very tempting extremes. The first extreme is naive harmonization.
What does that look like?
This is the fundamentalist urge to treat the Bible like a modern, literal, journalistic textbook. It's assuming every single number, date, and narrative detail will perfectly align with modern scientific and historical standards.
Right, the idea that the ancient writers cared about history the exact same way a 21st century academic does. And what's the other extreme?
The opposite extreme is reductionism. This is the skeptical assumption that because the text is heavily theological and features divine intervention, absolutely none of it actually happened, that it's all purely mythological fiction.
So the responsible academic truth lives somewhere in the tension between those two.
Exactly. The scholarly consensus is that authentic, verifiable historical events absolutely underlie these narratives. And we know this because archaeology proves it. However, the academic posture also acknowledges that archaeology can expose historical complexities, particularly in narratives that were orally transmitted and heavily shaped by later editors for specific theological purposes.
So it's not about proving the text is flawlessly true in every detail.
No. Archaeology doesn't exist to mechanically prove the Bible is true in a fundamentalist sense. It does something far more valuable. It confirms the world. It verifies the geopolitical reality, the existence of specific peoples, the infrastructure, and many of the major historical collisions. The rule of thumb in biblical scholarship is that archaeology informs and anchors our exegesis, our interpretation of the text, but it doesn't replace the text's primary goal, which is theology.
If archaeology anchors the text, let's talk about the actual anchors. Let's look at the stones. The source lists some incredible, tangible artifacts that act as independent, extra-biblical witnesses to this history. Let's start with the Merneptah stele. First of all, what is a stele, and why do we care about one from 1208 BCE found in Egypt?
Well, a stele is essentially a giant carved stone slab used as a public billboard in the ancient world, usually to brag about a king's military conquests. The Merneptah stele is a massive granite monument erected by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah in the city of Thebes. On it, he lists all the foreign enemies he has supposedly crushed. And tucked right in the middle of this bragging list is a hieroglyphic inscription that reads, "Israel is laid waste, its seed is not."
Wait, so the earliest mention of Israel outside the Bible is an Egyptian king bragging about wiping them out.
Exactly, and the historical significance of that cannot be overstated. Even though Pharaoh was clearly exaggerating about destroying them, this stone proves that by the late 13th century BCE, Israel undeniably existed as a recognized, distinct sociopolitical entity living in the land of Canaan. It anchors their presence on the map in hard granite.
That is fascinating. Let's jump forward a few hundred years to the Tel Dan stele from the 9th century BCE. Why was this such a blockbuster discovery?
For decades, there was a loud faction of minimalists in biblical scholarship who argued that King David was purely a myth. They argued he was essentially Israel's King Arthur,
Right.
a fictional hero invented centuries later to give the nation a glorious backstory. There was absolutely no archaeological proof he ever existed.
Until they dug up the Tel Dan stele.
Right. In 1993, archaeologists in northern Israel uncovered fragments of a victory monument written by an Aramean king. In the inscription, this enemy king is bragging about killing a king of Israel and a king of the house of David. It caused an absolute earthquake in the academic world. While a few stubborn scholars debate the translation, it is now widely accepted. It proves that within a century or two of his life, the Davidic dynasty was a real, historical, universally recognized lineage. David wasn't King Arthur. He was a historical monarch.
And speaking of enemy monuments, what about the Musha stele, also known as the Moabite stone, dating to the mid-9th century BCE?
This is one of my favorites because it's like finding a battle report written by the opposing general. The Mesha stele is a 34-line inscription commissioned by Mesha, the king of Moab. Moab was a nation located just east of the Dead Sea. The inscription details his bitter conflict and rebellion against the kingdom of Israel.
So we get the other side of the story.
Yes. What's incredible is that you can open your Bible to 2 Kings chapter 3 and read the Israelite account of this exact same war. Then you read the Moabite stone, and you get the geopolitical reality from the enemy's perspective. It perfectly aligns with the historical setting, the geography, and the politics of the biblical account, even though the Moabite king obviously puts his own spin on the outcome.
That is so cool. It's ancient political spin doctors at work. Now, the source also mentions the Samaria ostraca from the 8th century BCE. For the uninitiated, an ostracon is essentially a piece of broken pottery, right? Like ancient scrap paper.
Yes. In the ancient world, papyrus was expensive, but broken pottery was everywhere. If you needed to jot down a quick note or a receipt, you grabbed a shard of pottery and a reed pen with ink. These specific ostraca were found in the ruins of Samaria, the opulent capital of the northern kingdom of Israel before it was destroyed.
What's written on them? Deep theological musings.
No, they are incredibly mundane. They are administrative tax receipts for shipments of luxury goods, fine oil, and aged wine sent from local clans to the royal palace. But to a historian, they are pure gold. They map out the clan geography of the northern kingdom, they illuminate the complex royal taxation system, and they prove that literacy and bureaucracy were highly advanced in Israel during the 8th century.
We have records of kings and we have records of taxes. But what about the reality of surviving in this violent world? Let's talk about the Siloam inscription from the late 8th century BCE.
The context for this artifact is sheer terror. In the late 8th century, the unstoppable Assyrian army is marching toward Jerusalem to lay siege to it. If an ancient city loses its water supply during a siege, it dies in a matter of weeks. The biblical texts in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles tell us that King Hezekiah ordered a massive engineering project. They dug a tunnel straight through the solid bedrock beneath Jerusalem to divert the Gihon spring inside the city walls.
And the Siloam inscription proves they actually pulled it off.
Yes. In the 1880s, explorers waded into this pitch-black, claustrophobic tunnel and found an inscription carved directly into the rock wall. It wasn't written by a king bragging, it was written by the laborers. It dramatically describes the final moments of the excavation, detailing how two teams of diggers, starting from opposite ends, hacked blindly through the rock, following each other's voices until their pickaxes finally met in the middle. It provides irrefutable physical support for the late monarchic urban defense systems described in the Bible.
That is just incredible human drama etched into stone. But the tension gets even darker when we look at the Lachish letters from the early 6th century BCE.
These are arguably the most heartbreaking artifacts we have. These are military dispatches again, written in ink on pottery shards found in the guardroom of the destroyed fortress of Lachish, the second most important city in Judah. They date to the very eve of the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE.
What are they saying?
You are literally reading the frantic, desperate reports of a subordinate military commander stationed at a tiny outpost, writing to his superior in Lachish. In one of the letters, he writes that they are watching for the fire signals from Lachish because the signals from the neighboring fortress of Azekah have already gone dark.
Oh, wow. So Azekah had fallen.
Yes, Azekah had fallen. The Babylonian army was closing in. It intimately and tragically illuminates the final, suffocating crisis of Judah before the exile.
You can feel the panic in the ink. Now, finally, we have to talk about the crown jewel of biblical archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, dating from around 200 BCE to 70 CE.
The story of their discovery is legendary. A Bedouin shepherd boy throws a rock into a cave near the Dead Sea looking for a lost goat, hears something shatter, and accidentally stumbles upon the greatest archaeological find of the 20th century. Inside clay jars were thousands of scroll fragments. According to the data, about a quarter of these are biblical manuscripts. They found fragments of every single book of the Hebrew Bible except for the book of Esther.
And why did this totally revolutionize biblical scholarship?
Because before 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible we had dated to around the year 1000 CE. Skeptics logically argue that during that massive gap in time, monks and scribes must have altered, added to, or corrupted the text. But when scholars unrolled the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah, which was copied over 1,000 years earlier, they were shocked. It was virtually identical to the text we already had. It proved the staggering, almost obsessive textual stability and accuracy of the Jewish scribal tradition. It also gave us a window into the rich, diverse religious world of Second Temple Judaism during the time of Jesus.
Okay, so archaeology absolutely proves that these stories are anchored in a real world. These were real people. They were building real tunnels, sweating over tax receipts, hiding in fortresses, watching signal fires go out, and meticulously copying scrolls in desert caves. But to truly understand the weird, often jarring text they left behind, we have to get inside their heads. We have to strip off our 21st century mindset and understand the sociological context of life in the ancient Near East.
This is perhaps the hardest leap for a modern reader to make. Ancient Israel was a kinship-based, deeply agrarian, intensely honor-sensitive society. Things that are completely peripheral to us today, like tracking your lineage, protecting your ancestral plot of land, and maintaining the honor of your family name, were the absolute gravitational center of their universe.
I think this is a massive stumbling block. As modern Westerners, especially Americans, we read the Bible through a hyper-individualistic lens. We think religion is about my personal journey, my individual destiny, and my private relationship with God. But ancient Israel wasn't a collection of autonomous individuals making private choices. It was more like a massive, interconnected family corporation. The source highlights that the basic social building block wasn't the individual, it was the household. The Bet Av in Hebrew.
Yes, the house of the father. You didn't live alone in an apartment. You lived in an extended family compound. The patriarch, his wives, his sons, their wives, the grandchildren, the servants, they all lived and worked together as a single economic and social unit. Marriage was rarely about individual romantic fulfillment. It was a critical, covenantal, and economic alliance between two bedavs. Legal life wasn't handled by a distant federal government. It was ordered by divine law, mediated through local elders at the city gates. And as scholars consistently point out, this was a society driven entirely by the dynamics of honor and shame.
Explain how that dynamic works, because it's completely foreign to how we operate today.
In an individualistic culture, we are driven by guilt, an internal feeling that we have broken a rule. But ancient Mediterranean societies were oriented toward group value. Your honor, your public reputation, how your community perceived you dictated your literal survival. It determined who would trade with you, who would marry your children, and whether you received the blessing of inheritance. Conversely, shame was a social disease. If you sinned, it wasn't just a private failing, it was a public disgrace that tainted your entire household. This is exactly why genealogies matter so much in the Bible. They are maps of honor.
And we also have to remember that they were profoundly tied to the dirt. We buy our food wrapped in plastic at the grocery store. We have to remember the agrarian reality of ancient Israel. Their entire economic base, their survival, was dependent on agriculture. Growing grain, tending olive groves, cultivating vineyards, and herding flocks of sheep and goats on marginal rocky terrain.
Which means their literal physical survival dictated their theological imagination. When you read the Old Testament and see constant repetitive references to sowing and reaping, to the blessing of the morning dew, to the terror of a locust swarm, or the curse of drought, these aren't just pretty poetic flourishes used by writers to sound spiritual.
Right, they aren't just metaphors.
No, for an ancient Israelite farmer, a drought wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence for his children. So when the prophets declare that God is withholding the rain because of the nation's systemic injustice, that carries a terrifying, visceral, existential weight. Their theology is inextricably rooted in the soil.
Our source document also addresses something that is highly offensive and challenging for modern readers, and that is the pervasive reality of slavery and servitude in the ancient world. We read biblical laws that regulate owning people, and it makes modern readers incredibly uncomfortable.
It is a profoundly difficult topic, but our source offers a vital, historically nuanced view that is essential if we aren't going to just throw the book away. We have to understand that ancient Near Eastern servitude was not identical to the horrific, race-based, permanent chattel slavery that defined the American South and the transatlantic slave trade.
How is it different?
In the ancient agrarian world, there was no bankruptcy court, no social security, and no welfare state. If a famine hit and your crops failed, your family would starve. The only asset you had left was your labor. So the primary form of servitude was debt servitude. An Israelite would essentially sell their labor to a wealthier landowner for a set number of years to pay off a debt and survive.
But the biblical law didn't pretend this was some utopian ideal, right?
Exactly the opposite. The source makes the critical point that the biblical law in passages like Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15 did not idealize this reality. It aggressively regulated it. It treated debt servitude as a tragic symptom of a fallen, broken economic order.
So how did they regulate it?
The Torah put radical limits on the practice. It mandated that an Israelite could only be held in debt servitude for a maximum of 6 years, and in the 7th year, they had to be released. And not just released, but generously supplied with grain and livestock to start over. It was a harm reduction strategy designed to prevent the creation of a permanent generational underclass of slaves. It was revolutionary for its time, even if it obviously falls short of modern abolitionist ideals.
And speaking of how they structured their society, we have to talk about how they viewed politics and treaties. If you want to understand the Bible, you have to understand a concept called the suzerain-vassal treaty.
Yes. This is one of the most illuminating discoveries in biblical studies. In the ancient Near East, when a massive, terrifying emperor known as the suzerain conquered a tiny, weaker king, the vassal, they didn't just shake hands. They drew up a highly formalized, legal, political treaty. And historians have found these treaties all over the Hittite and Assyrian empires. They all follow the exact same structural template.
What does the template look like?
It always starts with a preamble identifying the emperor, I am the great king. Then comes a historical prologue where the emperor reminds the lesser king of what he's done for him. I saved your city from your enemies. Then come the stipulations, the heavy laws and taxes the lesser king must obey. And finally, a list of divine blessings if the treaty is kept, and horrifying curses if the vassal rebels.
It sounds a lot like a mafia boss running a protection racket. I kept your neighborhood safe, now here are my rules, and here's what happens to your knees if you cross me.
But why does this ancient political template matter to someone reading the Bible today?
Because if you open the book of Deuteronomy, the foundational text of the Jewish law, the entire book is structured exactly verbatim like an ancient Hittite suzerain-vassal treaty. The ancient Israelites took the standard, terrifying political language of imperial domination and applied it to their relationship with God. But they subverted it, right? Because while they borrowed the format, their covenant with YHWH was totally unique. The source points out that in Israel's mind, God was both the sovereign emperor and the redeemer. He wasn't a distant, greedy tyrant extracting taxes. He was the God who had just miraculously rescued them from the ultimate slave camp in Egypt.
That is the crucial subversion. By framing their relationship with God through this treaty structure, they were making a profound theological claim. Our God is a king, but his laws are not oppressive. They are the path to flourishing. It transformed a purely transactional, terror-based political contract into a deeply moral, intensely relational covenant of love and loyalty.
This deeply agrarian, honor-bound, politically subverted covenantal worldview is the exact lens you need when you approach this massive library. If you don't have that lens, the genres just won't make sense. Which brings us to part 4, looking at the text as a literary masterpiece.
As we established in the opening, the Old Testament is a library of diverse genres, not a single monolithic book. And knowing which genre you're holding is the key to interpreting it correctly. You don't read a poem the exact same way you read a tax code. Our source outlines the major literary categories.
Let's break those down one by one. First, we have narrative and historiography. This covers massive chunks of the text: Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, Samuel, Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah. What is the author's actual goal in these books?
Their goal is to interpret history as covenant history. They are not modern journalists trying to write an objective, unbiased timeline of events. They are theologians using historical events to analyze why things happen. They look at a battle or a famine and ask, did this happen because the king was faithful to the covenant or because he worshipped idols? It is history with a moral thesis.
Then you have the law: Exodus chapters 20 through 23, the entire book of Leviticus, and Deuteronomy.
These texts are the blueprint for the society. They define what holiness looks like. They painstakingly regulate the sacrificial system of worship. They establish social justice for the poor, and they forge the national identity. They're trying to answer the question, what does a human society look like when it actually reflects the character of the Creator?
Next is poetry and worship: the Book of Songs, Song of Songs, the Book of Lamentations.
If the law is the blue poem, the poetry is the emotional core. It gives voice to the highest heights of human praise, the darkest depths of depression and lament, and the most passionate expressions of human love. It is the raw, unfiltered language of the human heart responding to the reality of God.
And closely related to that is wisdom literature, books like Job, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes.
Wisdom literature is fascinating because it steps away from the grand history of the nation and focuses on the complexities of the individual life. It reflects on the daily practicalities of living well, the maddening mystery of why innocent people suffer, and the existential search for meaning in a world that often feels absurd and vain. It's basically ancient philosophy.
Then we have the massive genre of prophecy: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and all the minor prophets.
The prophets are the watchdogs of the covenant. They don't just predict the future. Their primary job is to critique the present. They bring the covenant lawsuit against a corrupt establishment, issue stark, terrifying warnings of impending judgment, but they also deliver the most profound, soaring promises of future restoration and hope.
And finally, the strangest genre for modern readers: apocalyptic or visionary literature. You see this in the second half of Daniel and parts of Zechariah.
Apocalyptic literature is crisis literature. It was written when the people were suffering under brutal empires. It uses highly symbolic, surreal, dreamlike imagery, beasts coming out of the sea, multi-headed dragons, to peel back the curtain of history and reveal that divine sovereignty is ultimately in control. It's meant to comfort a persecuted, terrified people by assuring them that the empires of the world will fall and God's kingdom will ultimately triumph.
What's truly genius about this library is how it weaves literary devices across all these different genres to create a unified story. The source highlights a device called typology. Explain typology to us, because it's everywhere once you know to look for it.
Typology is the idea that historical figures, events, and even institutions act as patterns or types that echo throughout history and are ultimately fulfilled by a later antitype. It's the idea that biblical history rhymes.
Give me an example of that rhyming.
Think about the Exodus. Moses leads the people out of slavery in Egypt through the chaotic waters of the Red Sea into a new life. That is a historical event. But hundreds of years later, when the prophets are comforting the people stuck in exile in Babylon, they don't just say, God will bring you home. They say, God is going to lead you on a new Exodus. They use the pattern of the past to promise a future reality. For the Christian reader, this culminates in Christ, who is seen as the ultimate Moses leading humanity in the ultimate Exodus out of the slavery of sin.
The story keeps folding back in on itself. But what actually holds all these genres and typologies together? The source calls it the redemptive historical analysis. It argues that the spine of the Old Testament is a progression of covenants.
Right. If you want to understand the overarching narrative, You cannot just look at isolated stories. You have to follow the chain of covenants. It is a continuous, unfolding architectural structure.
Let's walk the listener through that progression because it really unlocks the whole book. It starts at the very beginning with the Adamic or creation covenant in Genesis chapters 1 through 3.
The core promise here is life and flourishing under God's loving rule. It establishes humanity's royal vocation to cultivate the earth as image bearers. But it also introduces the tragedy of the fall, the human decision to seize autonomy, resulting in the curse of sin and death.
Then humanity spirals into violence, the flood comes, and afterward we get the Noahic covenant in Genesis 8 and 9.
God makes a universal promise, signified by the rainbow, to never again destroy the earth by a flood. He promises to preserve the physical rhythms of the natural world, seed time and harvest, summer and winter. This covenant doesn't save anyone spiritually. Rather, it provides the stable physical stage on which the rest of the long drama of redemption can safely play out.
With the stage set, God narrows his focus from the whole world to just one elderly childless man. The Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, 15, and 17.
This is the pivot point of the Bible. God makes a staggering threefold promise to Abraham. I will give you a miraculous seed or descendants. I will give your family a specific geographic land. And most importantly, through your family, all the nations of the earth will ultimately be blessed. It is the election of one family, but it is election for a global rescue mission.
Fast forward a few centuries, a family is a nation of slaves, God rescues them, and we reach the Mosaic covenant in Exodus 19 through 24.
This happens at Mount Sinai. God gives them the law. This covenant is conditional. It defines their national holiness, their worship, and how they are supposed to live as a kingdom of priests representing God to the surrounding pagan nations. If they obey, they are blessed in the land. If they rebel, they will be exiled from it.
They enter the land, eventually demand a king, and we reach the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7 and Psalm 89.
God makes an unconditional promise to King David that his dynasty will endure forever and that a son from his royal line will sit on the throne eternally. This is the birth of the intense messianic hope. From this moment on, Israel is looking for the ultimate son of David who will rule with perfect justice.
But the kings fail, the nation falls into idolatry, and Jerusalem is destroyed in the exile. It seems like the covenants have all failed. But then the prophets speak of a new covenant.
In texts like Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36, God promises a climactic restoration. He says, "The old covenant written on stone tablets was broken, so I will make a new covenant. I will write my law directly on their hearts. I will provide ultimate forgiveness of sins, and I will put my own spirit inside of them."
The logic of the entire Bible here is progression, not replacement. It's an hourglass shape. The promise starts wide with the whole world in Adam. It narrows down to one nation, Israel. It narrows further to the tribe of Judah, then to the line of David, and ultimately focuses down to one single person, the Messiah. And then through the Messiah, the blessing explodes outward again to encompass all the nations of the globe.
Exactly. The Old Testament is the essential prehistory of the gospel.
Now, to truly grasp the profound depth of this unfolding story, we have to learn a little bit of the original language. The specific Hebrew words chosen by these ancient writers unlock massive theological themes that often just get completely flattened out when we translate them into English. Let's do a quick crash course in biblical Hebrew. I'm going to throw out the key terms highlighted in our sources language study, and I want you to unpack the rich, multi-layered meanings for us.
I love this part. The vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible is the literal DNA of its theology.
All right, first up is the biggest one, Torah. In almost every English Bible, this is translated simply as law.
Which is a tragic and very limiting translation. When we hear law, we think of a traffic code or a tax manual, something restrictive and punitive. But the Hebrew root of Torah actually means instruction or teaching. It is the gracious, life-giving guidance of a loving parent meant to steer a child away from danger and into a flourishing life. When the writer of Psalm 1 says the blessed man meditates on the Torah day and night, he isn't obsessing over municipal zoning codes. He is delighting in the wisdom of his creator.
Next is a word that anchors everything we just talked about, Barrett.
Barit means covenant. It is the absolute central organizing principle of biblical theology, but it's more profound than a modern contract. In the ancient world, you didn't make a covenant. The literal Hebrew idiom is that you cut a covenant. It often involves sacrificing animals, cutting them in half, and the two parties walking between the bloody pieces, essentially saying, "May what happened to these animals happen to me if I break my promise." It is a solemn life and death binding of two parties in loyalty and obligation.
And speaking of that intense loyalty, the next word is hesed.
Hesed is notoriously difficult to translate. English Bibles try using phrases like steadfast love, mercy, or loving kindness. But hesed is not an emotion, it is an action. It specifically means covenant loyal love. It is the stubborn, unbreakable, fiercely relentless love that God has for his people solely because of the promise he made to them. When Israel rebels and deserves to be abandoned, God's hesed prevents him from walking away. It is the very core of God's character.
Okay, next we have kadosho.
Kadosh means holy or set apart. Primarily, it describes the terrifying, transcendent, awe-inspiring otherness of God. He is utterly distinct from creation. But what's amazing is that it also describes the calling of the people. In Leviticus, God says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." The people are called to be morally, ethically, and spiritually distinct from the brutal pagan empires surrounding them.
Let's look at tzedek, or tzedakah.
We usually translate this as righteousness or justice, but in our modern minds, justice means a legal standing in a courtroom or punishing a criminal. In the ancient Hebrew mindset, doing tzedakah was much broader. It was about maintaining moral order and social equity. Doing justice meant actively ensuring that the most vulnerable members of society, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, were protected and provided for. It meant the community was functioning exactly as God intended.
What about the word sheretted?
Sheret means the remnant. This is a crucial prophetic concept that provided immense hope. The prophets warned that because of the nation's idolatry, catastrophic judgment and exile were coming. But God promises that he will never completely wipe them out. He will preserve a faithful sheret, a small, purified remnant in the ashes, whom the ancient promises will continue. Judgment in the Bible is severe, but it is never the absolute end.
Next is a word many people might recognize, Mashiach.
Mashiach literally translates to the anointed one. In the Old Testament, when a king, a priest, or sometimes a prophet was installed into office, oil was poured over their head to signify their divine calling and empowerment. Over the centuries, especially as the earthly kings failed so miserably, this word became the root of intense expectation. They began looking for the Mashiach, the ultimate anointed one who would finally bring perfect justice and peace. In the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that word is Christos, Christ.
And finally, the word Shema.
Shema means to hear or to listen. But in Hebrew thought, listening is never just a passive auditory function where sound waves hit your eardrum. To truly hear is to obey. If a parent tells a child to clean their room and the child doesn't do it, the parent might say, "You didn't listen to me." That's the Hebrew concept. Deuteronomy 6:4 and 5 is the famous Shema prayer. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." It intimately ties the act of listening directly to active obedience and wholehearted love.
So how do these individual rich words build the larger theological architecture of the text? Our source breaks down several major theological pillars.
They form the foundation of everything the Bible claims. Take theology proper, the study of who God is. The Old Testament reveals a complex tension. God is both the transcendent, unapproachable creator of the cosmos who reigns over galaxies, but he is simultaneously the incredibly near, intimate covenant Lord who dwells in a tent with his people. He crushes arrogant empires, but he intimately hears the cries of a single abused slave woman like Hagar.
And it builds a very specific, somewhat controversial view of humanity. It's anthropology.
Yes, the Old Testament elevates humanity and simultaneously humbles it. Humans are presented as divine image bearers from page 1 of Genesis. We are not cosmic accidents. We have inherent profound dignity and a royal moral vocation. But simultaneously, we're deeply structurally fallen. The text insists that human sin isn't just a list of bad behaviors or mistakes. It's a systemic, arrogant rebellion against the Creator's design. We are glorious ruins.
And that leads to ecclesiology, the understanding of the community of faith. The covenant community in the Old Testament is gathered by the Word of God, maintained by sacrifice, led by the priesthood, and centered on the temple.
Right.
But what is absolutely vital to understand, and the source emphasizes this heavily, is that the people of God in the Old Testament are never merely an exclusive ethnic club.
Right.
I think that is a huge misconception.
Yeah.
People often read the Old Testament and think it's a xenophobic book just about the ethnic bloodline of the Israelites.
It's a common misreading, but the text constantly subverts that idea. It repeatedly includes outsiders. When the Israelites flee slavery in Egypt, the text says a mixed multitude of other oppressed peoples went up with them and joined the covenant. You have entire books dedicated to outsiders who demonstrate greater faith than the Israelites. Look at the book of Ruth. She is a Moabitess, a foreigner from an enemy nation. Yet, because she clings to the covenant, she is not only welcomed in, she becomes the great-grandmother of King David himself. The community is ultimately defined by covenant faithfulness to YHWH, not strictly by DNA.
And for the Christian reader, all of this theology, the holy God, the fallen humanity, the covenant community, the sacrifices, points in one singular direction. The source highlights the Christological interpretation. Following Jesus' own words in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, on the road to Emmaus, the New Testament authorizes reading the entire Old Testament as a massive, complex signpost pointing directly to Christ.
That is the Christian lens. The deliverance of the Passover lamb in Exodus becomes the historical pattern for the substitutionary deliverance of the cross. The physical tabernacle, where God's dangerous presence dwelled among the tents of the Israelites, perfectly anticipates the incarnation of Christ, who the Gospel of John says tabernacled among us in human flesh. The entire bloody Levitical system of animal sacrifice acts as a vast theological vocabulary lesson to prepare humanity to understand the ultimate, once-for-all atonement. The Old Testament is the essential vocabulary for the gospel.
But this grand theology wasn't lived out by perfect glowing saints with halos. It was lived out by incredibly flawed, messy, often catastrophic human beings. Let's look at the actual characters who drove this history. And honestly, this is one of the things I find most refreshing and authentic about the Old Testament. It absolutely refuses to hide the ugly, shameful sides of its greatest heroes. If this was just ancient nationalistic propaganda, they would have airbrushed the flaws to make their founders look like demigods.
The brutal honesty of the text is one of its most striking features. The biblical writers are remarkably subversive. Our source provides a fantastic strengths versus failures chart for key historical figures. It shows how their chaotic lives illustrate profound theological lessons about human nature and divine grace.
Let's evaluate a few of these figures. We have to start with Adam and Noah.
So Adam had the incredible, unearned vocation of representing God in a pristine creation, but his defining failure was profound, catastrophic disobedience. He chose autonomy over trust. The lesson the text draws is that humanity is fundamentally broken and desperately needs a faithful representative to fix what Adam broke. Then you have Noah. Noah showed incredible, resilient obedience under the threat of cosmic judgment, and God's grace preserved a remnant of humanity through him. But what happens the moment he gets off the ark? He immediately falls into drunkenness and shameful sin. The theological lesson is stark. God's grace preserves us, but the physical floodwaters could not wash away the internal disease of the human condition. Sin remains a post-flood reality.
Then you have Abraham, revered as the father of the faith. His strength was his radical, mind-bending obedience to leave his ancestral home, his security, and his honor, based entirely on a seemingly impossible promise from an unseen God. But his failure.
His failure was that he was highly prone to cowardice, fear, and self-serving compromise. On two separate occasions, when he felt physically threatened by foreign kings, he lied and said his beautiful wife Sarah was just his sister, essentially throwing her to the wolves to save his own skin.
And yet he is the man of whom the text says he believed the Lord and he counted it to him as righteousness. It shows that justification comes by trusting God, not by flawless moral performance. Then consider Moses, the great lawgiver, the mediator of redemption. His leadership, his humility, and his agonizing intercession for a rebellious, stiff-necked people were unparalleled. But his failure was striking the rock in anger to produce water instead of speaking to it as God explicitly commanded.
And the consequence of that anger was devastating. Moses, after wandering the desert for 40 years, was not allowed to cross the Jordan and enter the Promised Land. The source points out a profound theological lesson embedded in that narrative tragedy. The law, represented by Moses, can guide you through the wilderness, but the law cannot finally bring the people home to rest.
Wow. That is profound. Now, what about the kings? Let's do a rapid comparison of the first three monarchs, Saul, David, and Solomon.
This sequence of kings is a masterclass in the anatomy of leadership failure. Saul, the very first king, had incredible early promise. He had the physical stature, he looked the part, and he had military success. But he collapsed entirely due to internal paranoia, deep insecurity, and a refusal to obey the prophet Samuel. The lesson of Saul is that power without obedience collapses under its own weight.
Then we get David, famously called the man after God's own heart. He showed incredible devotion, physical courage against Goliath, and he wrote some of the most soaring, beautiful poetry in human history. But his failures were not just minor mistakes. They were catastrophic abuses of power. He committed adultery with Bathsheba, and then used his royal authority to have her husband Uriah murdered on the front lines to cover up the pregnancy.
It is a horrifying abuse of power. But what differentiates David from Saul is his response to confrontation. When the prophet Nathan confronts him, David doesn't execute the prophet or make excuses. He falls to the ground in deep, agonizing repentance, which we can read in Psalm 51. The lesson of David is that God's anointed king must be morally accountable. He is subject to the covenant law. He is not above it.
Finally, Solomon. He started with unmatched, divinely granted wisdom and staggering economic wealth. He successfully built the magnificent temple that his father David could only dream of.
But his failure was a divided, politically compromised, idolatrous heart. To secure his empire, he married hundreds of foreign princesses, forming political alliances, and he eventually built shrines to their pagan gods right on the hills facing the temple of YHWH. The lesson of Solomon is tragic. Great intellectual gifts, great institutional success, and great wealth do not guarantee spiritual faithfulness.
The major lesson that the source document pulls from analyzing all these leaders is incredibly sobering. It says, charisma without obedience is ruinous. You can have all the natural talent, all the political power, all the intellect, and even a genuine divine calling. But if you lack moral character and a baseline obedience to the covenant, you will inevitably destroy yourself and the people you are leading.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this is exactly why the Old Testament is so urgently relevant to us right now. We aren't just doing a museum tour of ancient history. We are reading a text that aggressively diagnoses the human condition.
Exactly. I want to bring this home. If you are listening to this deep dive while driving to work or folding laundry, why does this massive, complicated ancient library matter to you today?
It matters because the Old Testament fundamentally trains believers to think covenantally, not therapeutically, and that is a massive paradigm shift. Modern Western culture views religion primarily as a tool for personal self-actualization. It's therapeutic. God exists to make me feel fulfilled, to bless my individual plans, and to comfort me. The Old Testament shatters that narcissistic framework. It demands covenant fidelity. It tells us that our lives belong to the Creator. It insists that social justice is not an optional political add-on. It is the core of true worship.
All right, I think of the prophet Amos. In chapter 5, he famously screams at the religious establishment that God literally hates their beautiful worship services, he despises their religious festivals, and he won't listen to their songs. Why? Because while they are singing, they are simultaneously trampling the poor and denying justice to the marginalized in the courts. God refuses to be worshipped by oppressors.
It's a terrifying standard. The text also teaches us that human power is always accountable to God, not just to pragmatic results. We see that in the Judgment of the Kings. And I particularly love the point the source makes about the exile texts, specifically books like Daniel and Esther.
Why are the exile texts so relevant right now?
Because those books were written by people who were living as vulnerable minorities under massive, hostile pagan empires. They model how to live faithfully with intense moral integrity and political courage in high-pressure environments where your faith is marginalized, mocked, or even criminalized. For anyone trying to hold on to historical faith in a rapidly secularizing model culture, Daniel and Esther are survival manuals.
And beyond the political and social realms, for those who are just personally suffering, the Old Testament provides an unmatched, brutally honest vocabulary. It doesn't tell you to put on a fake smile. It validates the darkest parts of the human experience. Books like Job, the dark Psalms of Lament, and the shattered poetry of Lamentations validate suffering, profound moral ambiguity, and visceral grief. They teach us that true faith allows you to scream your pain and your questions directly at God without ever relativizing his ultimate sovereignty. It's a robust, gritty faith that can actually survive the real world.
In an age defined by deep cultural fragmentation, loneliness, and a crisis of meaning, the Old Testament answers our modern anxieties with the profound concept of covenant belonging. It tells the reader, you are not a random atom floating in a meaningless universe. You are part of a massive, multi-millennial story of redemption that is much larger than yourself.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. We started by staring at this overwhelming, dizzying library and realizing it is actually a carefully structured 24-book covenantal document. We traced the physical dirt of ancient Israel, from the wandering patriarchs to the devastating trauma of the Babylonian exile, and we saw how tangible archaeological stones, from Egyptian victory monuments to desperate letters written on broken pottery, firmly anchor the biblical text in real history. We stepped out of our modern individualism and into their honor-shame culture, realizing how their desperate agrarian survival shaped their vision of a God who brings the rain. We walked the architectural spine of the unbreakable covenants, from the Garden of Eden to the profound promise of a new covenant with a new heart. We unpack the rich, layered Hebrew vocabulary that forms the very DNA of biblical theology. And finally, we look closely at the glaringly flawed, messy heroes, from Abraham's cowardice to David's moral collapse, learning that charisma without character is a dead end. The Old Testament truly is the essential prehistory of the gospel, systematically teaching the church how to read reality through the lens of a covenant.
It is a genuinely remarkable, inexhaustible journey from the dawn of creation to the intense anticipation of Christ.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought, drawn from the source's deep emphasis on intergenerational memory. Think about Deuteronomy chapter 6, the famous Shema. Ancient Israel's absolute, literal survival as a distinct people, especially through the utter devastation of the exile and the total collapse of their physical culture, reside entirely on one thing: their ability to remember their narrative and intentionally pass it down to their children. In our modern age of endless, shallow information overload, where our attention spans are shrinking to the length of a 15-second video clip, what happens to a society that casually forgets its foundational narratives? If the Old Testament teaches us anything at all, it's that true, enduring identity isn't something we can just invent on our own in a cultural vacuum. It's something we receive from the past, we rigorously remember in the present, and we carefully pass down to the future. So as you go about your week, ask yourself, what stories are you repeating to anchor your identity when the pressure of the empire is on?
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive into the source material.
We'll see you next time.